This week I asked you to read a number of the sonnets from Elegiac Sonnets by Charlotte Smith, which was published first in 1784, and she continued to revise that for subsequent editions, making this one of the earliest texts in the course, and Smith one of the earliest writers in this course. You'll notice that in these lectures I don't tend to say a whole lot about the lives of the poets themselves. We spend a lot more time looking at the works. In this case, I think it's relevant to bring in a little bit of biographical information to give you a sense of where Smith was coming from. She was born in 1749, as I said, making her one of the earliest poets on this course, with the exception of Anna Letitia Barbald. She had an upper-class upbringing, but she was married off at the age of 15, partly to assure her upper-class status and partly to get her out of the way because her father was getting married to a new wife. Her husband was a spendthrift, a womanizer, and basically an all-around bad guy. Meanwhile, she had 12 children with him, 8 of whom survived infancy. So she basically spent most of her life trying to provide for her children, both through writing and through legal wrangling over her father-in-law's estate, which was not actually settled until after her death. Her husband's debts were so great that he was sent to prison, where she joined him. And although she was able to pay off his debts at that point, he was soon wanted again, and they ended up fleeing to France. Her literary endeavors began with the Elegiac Sonnets in 1784. They were very popular, but they didn't earn her a great deal of money. So she looked to novel writing as a more lucrative pursuit and produced pretty much a novel a year during the last decade of the 18th century and was fairly successful. She managed to pay off enough of her husband's debts to allow them to return to England, but then got an agreement of separation soon afterwards and struggled to achieve financial independence over the rest of her life. She died in 1806, having influenced a number of Romantic writers, including William Wordsworth, who called her a poet to whom English verse is under greater obligations than are likely to be either acknowledged or remembered. And of course, he was absolutely right. Her reputation fell as the 19th century wore on and has only recently really been rediscovered. So a few key points to draw from her life story. First of all, the age-old question of the relation between gender and genre. She considered herself a poet, she aspired to that status, but she wrote novels to pay the bills. And as a result, she's actually now more remembered as a novelist than a poet. So that should remind us that most of the canonical male romantic poets were independently wealthy or had patrons who helped support them. So this suggests that we need to think about the gendered hierarchy of art, which even Smith had clearly internalized. Why is poetry considered higher than other types of writing? Does writing out of necessity necessarily make art that is less worthy of being considered literary? Smith's necessity led her into a great deal of difficulty in trying to construct her public persona through her works. On the one hand, she adopts a conventionally docile feminine position in her work, obediently craving the public's indulgence in her having the temerity to write poetry and so on. But on the other hand, she felt the need to fight for her children, and by the time of the 6th edition of the Elegiac Sonnets, she explicitly criticized the legal system that was keeping her children's fortunes from them. She becomes increasingly vocal as her reputation increases, as she's willing to take more chances with her public. And Next week we'll read Beachy Head, which is a somewhat more aggressive poem, possibly because it is her final work. Her prefaces constantly seek to balance those protests with the so-called proper feminine stance. She concludes the preface to the 6th edition with the acknowledgement, "I am well aware that for a woman the post of honor is a private station," implying her recognition of boundaries that she's not supposed to overstep. Her vocal protestations and active claims on public pity made quite a few readers actually quite annoyed with her, and even started to irritate some of her friends. Since she was not legally allowed to participate in the court case over her children's legacies, she was forever hounding her influential friends to do something for her, to the point that some of them cut her off altogether. In short, then, her work reflects a keen awareness of the masculine bias of the social and legal systems, although she certainly was not in a position to be as outspoken about the plight of women as her contemporary Mary Wollstonecraft, for example. She does, however, share with Wollstonecraft and with some of the other writers we're going to look at a radical political sensibility, and her novels particularly were either praised or condemned because a woman dared to write about political issues at these difficult times. Which leads to a final interesting point. Although many women at the time wrote anonymously or under a pseudonym for fear of bringing down public disapproval on their heads, Smith always wrote under her own name. She even had her name published as Charlotte Smith of Bignor Park on the title page of the Elegiac Sonnets, a label that evokes her aristocratic upbringing and effaces the fact that she wrote some of those sonnets from a debtor's prison. Smith begins the preface to the 2nd edition by saying, "The little poems which are here called sonnets have, I believe, no very just claim to that title, but they consist of 14 lines and appear to me no improper vehicle for a single sentiment. I am told, and I read it as the opinion of very good judges, that the legitimate sonnet is ill calculated for our language." Again, we have a self-effacing feminine gesture. Smith is not claiming poetic genius here. She is simply improvising. She herself doesn't claim to be a very good judge, but defers to the opinion of others. And that's also echoed in the first poem in the sequence, where Smith's speaker only reluctantly accepts the role of poet. She essentially claims that she is only suited for the role because of her sufferings, not because of her particular genius, and she does not therefore claim a particular talent. If we look at Sonnet 11, To Sleep, we can see how it reflects the fact that Smith's poems include a number of very conventional features of 18th century poetry that later poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge would criticize, even as it also innovates on the 18th century in various ways. For example, the poem starts, "Come, balmy sleep," an apostrophe to a personified abstraction, a very conventional way of beginning a poem in the 18th century. The reference to Morpheus's airy court is an explicit reference to Greek mythology. Again, something that writers like Wordsworth felt was outmoded and not appropriate in contemporary England. And similarly, line 9, "Clasped in her faithful shepherd's guardian arms," a reference to the conventions of pastoral poetry, and again, a very conventional and classical form of writing. But while Smith's language is conventional in many ways, it also ties in with the cult of sensibility that I mentioned in a previous video. But it's worth noting that her use of that language is primarily within the context of herself. She asserts an affinity with inanimate objects, with personified abstractions, much more than with any other living creatures in the poem. So she is inviting readers to empathize with her, that she is to be the object of their sensibility rather than her being the subject sympathizing with others. It's also worth noting, we've talked about what sonnets are, but it's worth noting the other half of the title of this work, the elegiac part. An elegy is a particular type of poem, again, a very conventional kind of poem, one that specifically is mourning the death of a friend or someone whom the poet is very close to. So again, Smith's sonnets are elegiac, but in a very different sense. The subject of the poem is not a lost loved one, but it's the speaker's own feelings of sorrow that are dwelt on. We don't really know why the speaker is sad, depressed. I gave you a sense of Charlotte Smith's own history, so you would have some sense of where that's coming from, but readers would not necessarily have access to that information. They would be presented with this poetic speaker who is inviting sympathy without necessarily giving specific grounds for it. If we look at another particular example, the sonnet To Night, number 39. First of all, pay attention to the rhyme scheme of this poem. It starts ABAB, making us think it's going to be a Shakespearean sonnet, but then continues CBBC, CDDC, EE. It becomes sort of Petrarchan in the middle and then ends with a couplet. But also notice how each quatrain, if they are quatrains, links to the next. The B's in the first quatrain are repeated, then the C's in the second quatrain are repeated in the third, suggestive of the speaker's search for a feeling of relief that is never found on earth. We see a turn at line 9 of the poem, which is signaled by the word though. Notice again the frequency with which we have those words that signal the turn, that something is changing. The first 8 lines describe how much she loves the night, and then lines 9 through 14 talk about how she, even though she loves it, she recognizes that it is incapable of offering relief. So again, we have a very depressing conclusion to the sonnet, with the conclusion that there is no respite from suffering on earth. In conclusion, then, what I want us to get out of this work is the way that Smith anticipates a romantic turn inwards. What matters is less what happens than how it feels. So even as she's drawing on these earlier poetic traditions in terms of the language she uses, she's anticipating a kind of shift in terms of how we think about poetry from the 18th to the 19th century. And again, the tension that we can see within these poems between the stereotypically feminine reluctance to promote herself and a much more assertive declaration of the value of her work. And again, we'll see this maybe a bit more pronouncedly in next week when we look at her longer poem, Beachy Head.